All right, so today we're diving deep into World War One. You sent over some incredible material, and we're going to break it all down. The events, the major players, the impact. We're talking way more than just the basic facts right now.
Yeah, it's interesting. Most people know World War One was this huge event, but they don't always get the whole picture, the causes, the consequences, why it still matters so much even now.
That's what we're here to uncover. So it all started with this event that at first seems isolated, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Remember that
Yeah.
back in school, the spark that started the war. But what our sources show is that Europe was already on edge, like really tense.
Oh, yeah. 1914 Europe was a powder keg, just waiting to explode. All these alliances and rivalries. So this assassination, it was tragic, but it was also the thing that set off this chain reaction, pulling countries into war incredibly fast.
It's crazy how quickly it all went down.
Yeah.
Like, boom, a regional conflict in the Balkans turns into a global war. Germany, Russia, France, Great Britain, all in.
Just like a domino effect. You had this alliance system, and it was so fragile. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, and because Russia was allied with Serbia, they jumped in to defend them. Then Germany, allied with Austria-Hungary, declared war on Russia, and France, because they were allied with Russia, they joined in too. Then Great Britain, allied with France and Belgium, they get pulled in after Germany invades Belgium.
Wow, that's wild. It shows how interconnected the world already was, even back then. So let's bring it down. Who are the main players? We've got the Allied powers, the Triple Entente, France, Russia, and Great Britain. Later, Italy, Japan, and crucially, the United States joined them.
And on the other side, you have the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. Bulgaria joined them a bit later. And it's important to remember these weren't just names on a map, you know? These were empires, and each one had their own reasons for getting involved.
Right, with huge populations and territories. It's just mind-blowing to think about the scale of it all.
Mhm.
But when most people think about World War One, they think about trench warfare, the Western Front. Those images are so powerful, the endless mud, the constant threat of death. It must have been terrifying.
Absolutely. The Western Front stretched from Belgium all the way to Switzerland, and it was essentially a stalemate. Just imagine. Miles of these deep trenches full of mud. Soldiers lived there for months under constant attack. And it wasn't just the physical dangers. Imagine the psychological toll that took.
It's hard to even imagine what those soldiers went through. And one battle that really captures the horrors of trench warfare is the Battle of the Somme. It's known for its immense loss of life and how pointless it all seemed.
Yeah, the Battle of the Somme in 1916 is a really tragic example of attrition warfare. The goal was basically just to wear down the enemy, just keep attacking relentlessly, over 1 million casualties. For a few miles of land, the machine gun and other technology had advanced so much faster than the tactics, and the result was just devastating.
1 million casualties. It's almost impossible to grasp the scale of that loss. The Somme really shows how technology can get ahead of strategy and what happens when it does. But the Somme wasn't the only battle where we see this clash between old tactics and new technology.
Yeah.
The Battle of Verdun, also in 1916, was another terrifying example.
Verdun was this brutal test of endurance, a back and forth between the French and German armies that went on for months. Both sides just poured resources and manpower into it, leading to, again, hundreds of thousands of casualties, and for very little territorial gain.
So it's like both sides were locked in this horrible struggle, just unable to break free from this cycle of attrition. But at the same time, technology kept advancing, like at a crazy pace, like the world was being reshaped right there on the battlefield.
It really was. And on top of the horrors of trench warfare, World War I also saw this huge leap in technology. We've talked about the machine gun, but there were also tanks, poison gas, airplanes, all these new weapons that changed the way wars were fought forever.
Yeah, it's both fascinating and terrifying, right? Like, the weapons got way more deadly, but the ways they were used were still stuck in the past. It's no wonder there were so many casualties.
Exactly. Military leaders were still thinking about these massive infantry charges, like something out of the Napoleonic Wars. But those tactics just didn't work against the firepower of machine guns and artillery.
So it makes the tragedies of the Somme and Verdun even more, well, tragic. But the war wasn't just limited to those battlefields, right? That we often forget that World War One had this global impact.
Oh, absolutely. Most of the fighting happened in Europe, but it involved colonies and soldiers from all over the world. Soldiers from British India, French colonies in Africa, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, all fighting in a war far from their homes.
It makes you realize that even though it seems like ancient history, World War I had these far-reaching effects that were felt all over the globe. The sources you provided actually had this really powerful story about a group of soldiers from Senegal.
Yes, the Senegalese tirailleurs. They were fighting for France, thousands of miles from home. And they faced not only the dangers of war, but also discrimination from some of their fellow soldiers. It's a story that really highlights the complexities of World War I and these often forgotten perspectives.
It's incredible to think about all these sacrifices made by people all around the world pulled into this conflict that really, in many ways, changed global politics. And
Mhm.
speaking of global shifts, a major turning point in the war was when the United States entered in 1917.
Right. The U.S. had stayed neutral for the first few years of the war. But then the Lusitania, a British passenger ship with American citizens on board, was sunk by a German U-boat. And that, along with other factors, pushed public opinion towards joining the Allies.
I can only imagine how much that changed things. The U.S. brought in fresh troops, tons of resources, and this huge industrial capacity.
Yeah, it really was a turning point. The U.S. entering tipped the balance in favor of the Allies. It also added to the pressure the Central Powers were already feeling, fighting on multiple fronts.
So it wasn't just the military strength of the U.S. that mattered. The Central Powers were also facing their own problems, internal challenges.
Definitely, especially Germany. They were dealing with food shortages, a struggling economy, and growing unrest politically. The war had really taken its toll, and it was getting harder for them to keep fighting.
And all that internal pressure, combined with the stronger Allied forces, eventually led to the armistice, November 11th, 1918, Armistice Day, or Veterans Day as we know it now.
Yes, it's a day to remember those who served and the sacrifices that were made. But it's also important to remember that even though the fighting stopped, the story didn't end there. The aftermath of World War I was really complicated and, in a lot of ways, set the stage for future conflicts.
That's a really good point. We tend to focus on the battles and the armistice, but the peace treaty that came after was just as important, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. The Treaty of Versailles was signed in 1919, and it officially ended the war. But it also put really harsh penalties on Germany. They had to accept full blame for the war, pay huge reparations, give up territory, and drastically reduce their military.
Those are some serious consequences. It makes you wonder, did the treaty, in trying to create peace, actually make another war more likely?
That's a question historians still debate today. The Treaty of Versailles was supposed to punish Germany and prevent them from starting another war. But those harsh terms created resentment and economic instability in Germany, which, as we know, would contribute to the rise of extremist ideologies like Nazism and ultimately the outbreak of World War II.
It's kind of a tragic irony, isn't it? The effort to prevent future wars might have actually made another one inevitable.
It really shows the complexities of peacemaking and the unintended consequences of our actions, even when we have the best intentions. The Treaty of Versailles reminds us that creating lasting peace isn't just about ending a war. It also means addressing the root causes of the conflict.
Yeah, it really makes you think how even good intentions can have these, like, ripple effects that we don't expect. Yeah. But let's shift gears for a bit. Let's talk about the human cost of the war. We can get caught up in the dates, the battles, all that, but it's the individual stories that really hit home, you know?
Absolutely. The human cost of World War I was just enormous. Over 16 million people died, soldiers and civilians, and millions more were injured, physically and mentally. Whole generations wiped out, families torn apart. The trauma of this war, it had a lasting impact on societies all around the world.
It's heartbreaking to think about that loss and how it shaped families and communities for generations. And it wasn't just individuals, right? The whole political landscape of the world changed. Empires crumbled. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, the German Empire. It led to the creation of new nations and completely redrew the map of Europe.
It did. And the war also had this huge social impact, speeding up changes that were already happening. Like women started taking on roles that were traditionally held by men, contributing to the workforce in a whole new way. And that helped fuel the movement for women's suffrage and challenge traditional gender roles.
That's a great point. It's often said that war can be a catalyst for social change, and World War I seems like a perfect example of that. And of course, there were all the technological advancements in medicine, transportation, communication,
Yeah.
all driven by the needs of war.
Right. And we can't forget the impact on art and literature. Think about writers like Ernest Hemingway, Eric Maria Remarque, Wilfred Owen. Their work really captures the brutality of war, the disillusionment, the horror. It forced people to confront the dark side of humanity and really wrestle with what it all meant.
And their words are still powerful today, right?
Mm.
Reminding us about the human cost of conflict and how storytelling can help us understand these experiences. So World War I, it wasn't just about battles and treaties. It shaped culture, the way people thought for generations.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that war isn't just about battles and treaties. It's about people, about the lives lost, the lives changed forever, and the lasting impact on societies, on the course of history.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into World War I, what are some of the key things you hope our listeners will take away from this?
Well, first, just the sheer scale of this conflict, how global it really was. It wasn't just a European war. It involved people from all over the world, which just highlights how interconnected we are and how global events can have these far-reaching
And
consequences.
of course, the human cost. Millions of lives lost and shattered. And all the changes that came out of it, socially, politically, technologically. And, we talk about how the desire for peace, as seen in the Treaty of Versailles, can sometimes backfire.
Yeah. The treaty, it was meant to prevent future wars, but it might have actually helped create the conditions that made another world war more likely.
A complex lesson for sure. So, to our listener, as you continue to explore this period in history, I encourage you to, really dig into those personal stories, look at the technological innovations, and think about the political complexities that shape the world we live in today.
Yeah, and maybe most importantly, think about the lessons of World War One. How can we apply those lessons to our own time? What can we do to work towards a future where diplomacy and understanding are the norm and the horrors of a global conflict like this are never repeated?